In today's video, we follow Joseph Thompson, the newly elected governor, as he embarks on a clandestine mission to experience firsthand the safety and conditions of his state's communities. Dressed down and incognito, Joseph explores Oakwood Heights, a seemingly tranquil and affluent neighborhood. What begins as a journey of discovery soon takes a dramatic turn when his presence is misinterpreted by Officer Mark Tanner. The officer's suspicion escalates, leading to a tense and unjust confrontation. Despite Joseph's calm attempts to explain his true intentions, he is wrongfully arrested, highlighting deep-seated biases and the challenges of bridging the gap between public perception and reality. Join us as we delve into this compelling story that shifts from hopeful curiosity to the harsh reality of prejudice and misunderstanding. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Joseph Thompson, a black man in his late 50s, stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the well-worn baseball cap perched atop his head. The reflection staring back at him was a stark departure from the polished image of the governor that the public was accustomed to. The crisp suit and tie that usually defined his public persona had been replaced with faded jeans and a simple blue shirt. His hand moved over his clean-shaven face, feeling the mingled excitement and anxiety bubbling up inside him. "This is it," he murmured, his eyes brimming with resolve. "It's time to see the true state of our communities." As the newly inaugurated governor, Joseph felt a profound sense of duty to grasp the reality of safety within his state. He was deeply unsettled by the disconnect he sensed between the official reports and the lived experiences of his constituents. The statistics and summaries on his desk felt sanitized, failing to capture the true essence of life on the ground. He needed to witness it firsthand, to experience the daily realities of the people he served. Taking a deep breath, Joseph slipped out of the governor's mansion with quiet determination, being careful not to alert his security team to his absence. The cool night air nipped at his skin as he walked to a modest sedan parked discreetly a block away. Settling into the driver's seat, he felt a pang of guilt for deceiving his staff, but he was convinced that this unorthodox approach was crucial for understanding the real issues at hand. His first destination was Oakwood Heights, an affluent neighborhood renowned for its pristine lawns and low crime rate. As he drove through the serene streets flanked by grand mansions, an uneasy feeling settled over him. The meticulously trimmed hedges and imposing fences seemed less like decorative elements and more like barriers, isolating the homes from the outside world. Parking his car near a small, unassuming park, Joseph stepped out and began his walk. The streetlights cast a warm, inviting glow on the sidewalks, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves stirred by the breeze. It was a tranquil scene, almost unnervingly so. As he wandered through Oakwood Heights, Joseph couldn't help but reflect on the stark contrast between this neighborhood and the one from his childhood. He remembered the lively sounds of laughter and music echoing from open windows and the rich aroma of diverse cuisines drifting through the air. Here, everything felt closed off, detached from the vibrancy he remembered. Continuing his nocturnal exploration, Joseph's eyes scrutinized the surroundings with a mix of curiosity and concern. The streetlights created long, eerie shadows across the impeccably maintained lawns, emphasizing the divide between light and darkness. He observed that while the main thoroughfares were well lit, several of the side streets were shrouded in dimness, almost neglected. As he ventured onto one of these poorly lit streets, a shiver ran down his spine. The deepening shadows made him contemplate the sense of vulnerability someone might experience while walking here alone. He resolved to investigate improving the lighting in these less illuminated areas. Joseph's footsteps created a soft echo on the pavement, the only sound piercing the otherwise still night. He was acutely aware of the risks involved in his covert mission, but he believed it was an essential part of his effort to connect with the community on a genuine level without the buffer of a security detail or official vehicle, just a man navigating the streets. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Tanner was patrolling the tranquil streets of Oakwood Heights, his trained eyes scanning the area with seasoned vigilance. After 2 decades on the force, Mark knew this neighborhood intimately. The well-maintained lawns and elegant homes represented a stark contrast to the rougher areas he had patrolled in his early years. Nothing ever happens around here, but that's what makes it so easy to overlook something, Mark mused. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, his headlights picked up on a solitary figure walking slowly along the sidewalk. The figure, clad in dark clothing and with hands tucked into pockets, seemed incongruous against the backdrop of the impeccably kept surroundings. The man's leisurely pace and casual demeanor stood out, piquing Mark's curiosity as he continued his patrol. Mark's instincts flared into high alert, a chill creeping up his spine as he felt a knot of suspicion tighten in his gut. It was nearly midnight, and this was not the sort of neighborhood where people strolled casually at this hour. The normally quiet street, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and pristine lawns, was unnervingly silent. Mark's brow furrowed deeply as he slowed his cruiser, his eyes scanning the stranger more intently. The man loitering on the sidewalk was dressed in plain, unremarkable clothes, quite the contrast to the designer attire typically worn by the affluent residents in this area. Mark's sense of unease grew with every passing moment. Years of experience on the force had honed Mark's ability to read people and situations with unsettling accuracy, and right now, every instinct he had was telling him that something was off. From the safety of his patrol car, Mark observed the stranger's repeated pacing with a growing sense of alarm. He had seen this behavior before people who cased neighborhoods, searching for potential targets for theft or worse. "Not on my watch," Mark muttered through clenched teeth, his jaw set with determination. The peaceful appearance of the neighborhood, with its meticulously maintained homes and well-manicured lawns, seemed to stand in stark contrast to the disheveled figure wandering its streets. Mark's mind raced through a series of scenarios. Was this man planning a burglary? Was he part of a gang scouting for future victims? The more Mark thought about it, the more convinced he became that immediate action was necessary. With his heart pounding and adrenaline surging, Mark made his decision. He wouldn't allow this neighborhood to become a victim of crime, not while he was on duty. He could feel the weight of his badge and the responsibility it carried fueling his resolve as he reached for his holster and stepped out of the cruiser. "Time to put an end to this," he said firmly to himself, striding purposefully toward the stranger. As he approached, his posture was assertive, his steps firm and deliberate. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the quiet neighborhood, heightening the tension in the air. Mark's hand rested on his holster, ready to act if necessary. He was prepared to confront the suspicious individual and put a stop to any illicit activities. "Hey, you," Mark's voice cut through the stillness of the night, authoritative and sharp. "What do you think you're doing out here at this hour?" The stranger turned calmly, meeting Mark's gaze with a composed expression. "Good evening, officer," he replied softly. "I'm just taking a walk and observing the area." Mark's eyes narrowed further, suspicion etched deeply into his features. "A walk at this time of night? In this neighborhood? I don't think so. Let's see some ID." The man, Joseph, reached slowly into his pocket, maintaining steady eye contact with Mark. "Of course, officer. I understand your concern. I'm here to assess the safety of the area." Mark scoffed, his tone growing more hostile. "Safety assessment? That's a new one. I've seen your type before." As Joseph produced his ID, Mark grabbed it from his hand, barely glancing at it before tossing it back with a dismissive gesture. "This doesn't explain why you're here. I've been watching you pace up and down this street. You're casing these houses, aren't you?" Joseph took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Officer, I assure you that's not the case. If you would just listen." "Listen," Mark interrupted sharply, his voice rising with frustration. "I've heard enough lies in my time on the force. You think I don't know what's going on here?" Joseph tried once more to explain, his voice strained. "Sir, if you'd just allow me to clarify." But Mark wasn't interested in explanations. His face flushed with anger as he cut Joseph off once again. "Save it. I know your type. You come into nice neighborhoods like this, thinking you can take advantage of honest, hard-working people. Well, not on my watch." Mark's aggressive demeanor and hostile tone created an increasingly tense and uncomfortable atmosphere. Despite Joseph's best efforts to remain calm and collected, it was clear that the officer was not open to hearing him out. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Joseph came to the unsettling realization that his attempt to quietly assess the neighborhood's safety had taken a perilous and unexpected turn. Joseph drew in a deep, steadying breath, trying to maintain his composure amid the mounting hostility. "Officer," he began, his voice gentle and deliberate, "I understand that my presence here might be concerning, but I assure you I mean no harm. I am simply conducting a personal safety inspection of the neighborhood." Mark's face contorted in skepticism. "A personal safety inspection at this hour? Do you expect me to believe?" That his hand tightened around the grip of his holster, his posture growing more menacing. Joseph held firm, his voice unwavering as he explained, "That's exactly right. I'm assessing various areas in our community to better understand potential risks after dark. I chose nighttime for this assessment to get a clearer picture of the safety conditions." Mark's disbelief was palpable as he shook his head, his eyes narrowing with growing suspicion. "Nice try, buddy. I've heard every excuse in the book. You're just making up stories to cover your tracks." Joseph could see the anger and distrust deepening in Mark's eyes, and he felt a sinking feeling in his chest. It was becoming painfully clear that the officer was not inclined to accept any reasonable explanation. The tension in the air was almost tangible, like a tightly coiled spring on the verge of snapping. "Officer, please," Joseph urged, his voice now tinged with a note of desperation. "If you would just allow me to explain." "Explain what?" Mark interrupted sharply, his voice rising in intensity. "How you're casing these houses and planning your next break-in. I've dealt with guys like you before, always coming up with stories and excuses. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." Joseph was overwhelmed by a wave of frustration. He had hoped that by remaining calm and honest, he could help the officer understand his true intentions. But it was becoming clear that Mark's bias was preventing him from seeing the truth. "Sir," Joseph said, struggling to keep his voice steady, "I assure you that's not the case. I'm simply trying to do my job and ensure the safety of our community." Mark took a step closer, his face flushed with anger. "Your job? Don't make me laugh. The only job you seem to have is causing trouble. Now you're coming with me to the station, and we'll sort this out there." As Mark reached for his handcuffs, Joseph felt a wave of dread. What had begun as a routine safety check had now escalated into a dangerous confrontation, all because of the officer's unwillingness to see past his prejudices. Despite Joseph's continued efforts to clarify the situation, Mark's suspicions only grew stronger. The officer's face grew colder, his eyes filled with distrust. Rather than easing Mark's concerns, Joseph's calm demeanor seemed to only deepen the officer's suspicions. "You're cool for someone caught red-handed," Mark growled, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've seen your type before, smooth talkers who think they can talk their way out of anything." Joseph opened his mouth to offer another explanation, but it was clear that Mark had already made up his mind. Without further hesitation, the officer reached for his handcuffs. "That's enough out of you. You're under arrest." Joseph's heart sank as he realized the full gravity of the situation. His well-intentioned safety assessment had led to this unforeseen and troubling outcome. As Mark roughly seized his wrists and slapped the cold metal cuffs around them, Joseph made a conscious decision to stay calm and cooperative, hoping to navigate this escalating crisis with as much dignity as possible. "Please, officer," Joseph implored softly as Mark tightened the handcuffs around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. "I understand that you're just doing your job, but there's been a terrible misunderstanding." Mark, however, appeared indifferent to Joseph's pleas, his focus solely on the task at hand. With a rough grip, he directed Joseph toward the waiting patrol car, his hold on Joseph's arm so tight it felt like it might bruise. "Save it for the station," Mark barked, his voice dripping with disdain. As they made their way down the street, Joseph could feel the prying eyes of neighbors peering out from behind their curtains, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. The peacefulness of the night had been abruptly disrupted by this unwelcome scene, and Joseph felt a deep pang of regret and guilt for the disturbance he had unwittingly caused. A sense of betrayal and helplessness washed over him as he realized that his earnest attempt to resolve the situation was falling on deaf ears. Mark pushed Joseph roughly into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a finality that resonated with a sense of injustice. As Mark settled into the driver's seat, Joseph caught a brief, unsettling glimpse of the officer's face in the rearview mirror. It was an expression of grim satisfaction, a disturbing mask of triumph that made Joseph's stomach churn. It was clear that Mark was oblivious to the gravity of the mistake he was making. As the engine roared to life, Mark's eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror, a hint of paranoia mingling with his sense of self-righteousness. In the confined space of the patrol car, Joseph sat silently, his face a mask of calm resignation, while inside he was a storm of anxiety and frustration. The quiet streets outside seemed to mock his predicament as they passed by, each streetlight a silent witness to the unfolding injustice. Mark's sense of pride swelled with each passing block, fueled by his conviction that he had successfully intercepted a potential threat to the community. "You picked the wrong area to case, buddy," he said with a gruff tone, his voice laced with a self-satisfied edge that grated on Joseph's nerves. Joseph remained silent, choosing not to reveal his identity and risk further complicating the situation. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, using the ride as an opportunity to gather his thoughts and mentally brace himself for the challenges ahead. Mark, interpreting Joseph's silence as a sign of guilt, continued his tirade with increasing fervor. "You criminals think you're so clever, but you can't fool me. I've been doing this job for years. I know trouble when I see it." Each harsh word was like a dagger, driving deeper into Joseph's already bruised sense of injustice. The journey to the station felt interminably long, each mile stretching out as if mocking Joseph's predicament. The tension in the car was palpable, a heavy weight that seemed to press down on him with every passing moment. When they finally arrived at the station, Mark's rough handling of Joseph as he yanked him from the back seat was more than just physical, it was a statement of dominance and contempt. The bustling activity inside the station came to an abrupt halt as officers turned their attention to the new arrival. Mark strode towards the booking area with a look of triumph, his sense of accomplishment almost palpable. "Got a suspicious character loitering in Oakwood," he announced with a flourish, pushing Joseph forward. "Caught him red-handed casing the neighborhood." The reaction from the other officers was mixed. Some nodded in approval, while others seemed more uncertain. Among them, a young rookie named Sarah stepped forward, her voice tinged with concern. "Did he resist arrest?" she asked, her eyes softening as she looked at Joseph. "Nah," Mark replied dismissively, his tone still dripping with disdain. "But that doesn't mean he's innocent. These smooth talkers are the worst kind. They think they can talk their way out of anything." As Joseph was led to the booking desk, he felt the collective gaze of the officers on him, their stares heavy with unspoken judgments and assumptions. The air was thick with a tense silence, the unspoken questions hanging like a dense fog. Joseph's heart pounded in his chest as he wondered how Mark and the others would react when the truth finally emerged, and he hoped against hope that they would come to see the mistake they had made. Mark's demeanor remained stern and unyielding as he led Joseph to the booking area, the tension in the station palpable. The veteran officer's face was set in a rigid expression of suspicion, his eyes narrowed and unrelenting. Joseph, in stark contrast, held his composure with quiet dignity, a calm that seemed to unsettle the aggressive energy radiating from Mark. "Name," Mark demanded gruffly, his pen poised over the booking form with a sense of finality. Joseph hesitated for a moment, his voice steady but soft as he replied, "Joseph Thompson." The name, written hastily by Mark, held no immediate significance for him. Mark continued with the routine questions, his impatience evident in his brusque tone. Joseph answered each query with unshakable clarity, his calm demeanor a silent protest against the injustice he was enduring. As the booking process dragged on, the other officers in the station cast curious glances their way. The stark contrast between Mark's aggressive attitude and Joseph's composed silence was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in his office, Police Chief Davis was preparing for what he had anticipated would be a quiet night shift. The sudden ring of the phone on his desk shattered the silence, and he picked it up, his brow furrowing as he listened. "Chief Davis speaking," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. The words from the caller were alarming, causing his eyes to widen in disbelief. "The governor is doing what he asked," his voice rising in shock as the gravity of the situation became clear. The call was a harbinger of a much larger issue, one that would soon unravel and demand answers. Chief Davis felt a cold knot tightening in his stomach as he absorbed the gravity of the news. Governor Thompson was conducting an undercover safety assessment in their area, and the chief's mind raced frantically, trying to recall any reports from his officers that might indicate something unusual. "Thank you for the heads up," Chief Davis said, his voice betraying the tension he felt. "We'll keep an eye out." After hanging up the phone, his gaze was drawn to the booking area. He noticed Mark, one of his officers, processing a man who seemed out of place compared to their usual suspects. A chilling thought began to form in his mind. Chief Davis sprang from his chair, the abrupt movement causing it to scrape loudly against the floor. He walked briskly towards the booking area, his heart pounding with increasing intensity. The distance between him and the booking area seemed to stretch endlessly as he approached, and he could hear Mark's gruff voice mingling with the calm responses of the man being booked. The urgency of the situation gripped him tighter with each step. He quickened his pace, desperately hoping that his fears would prove unfounded. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As he neared the booking area, the chief's worst suspicions were confirmed. His stomach dropped as he recognized the man Mark was processing. It was none other than Governor Joseph Thompson. Chief Davis's face flushed with panic as he burst into the room. His eyes locked onto Joseph, who stood composed yet restrained by handcuffs next to Mark. The chief's voice wavered as he gasped, "Oh my God, release him now." Mark, startled by the chief's sudden and urgent arrival, looked up in confusion. "Sir," he asked, his voice tinged with bewilderment. The chief, trembling with a mix of fear and urgency, rushed forward and fumbled with the keys, determined to remove the handcuffs himself. "This is Governor Joseph Thompson," he said, his voice barely steady. Mark's face drained of color as he stared at Joseph in disbelief. The pen he had been holding clattered to the floor, the sound piercing through the now silent room. Governor Mark stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "But I thought..." Joseph gently rubbed his wrists as the handcuffs fell away. He looked at Mark with a blend of understanding and disappointment. "It's all right," Chief Joseph said softly. "I chose not to reveal my identity earlier." The atmosphere in the station shifted dramatically. Officers who had been trying to act nonchalant now openly stared, their expressions a mix of surprise and embarrassment. The gravity of what had just happened began to sink in, enveloping everyone in a state of stunned silence. Chief Davis turned to face his officers, his expression grave. "Everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the tension, "this is Governor Joseph Thompson. He was conducting an undercover safety assessment of our community when this unfortunate incident occurred." Mark stood frozen, his face a portrait of horror, as the full realization of his actions hit him. He had arrested the governor, the very individual he had sworn to protect and serve. "Governor Thompson," Mark started, his voice cracking with emotion. Joseph raised a hand to silence Mark's stammered apology. His eyes were a mix of sadness and resolve. The room held its breath, waiting to see how he would respond to this monumental mistake. Mark remained rooted to the spot, his face etched with shame and disbelief. The realization of his actions felt almost unbearable. The other officers, equally stunned, reacted in various ways, some staring open-mouthed at the unfolding scene, while others turned away, unable to witness Mark's public humiliation. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension and a palpable sense of embarrassment. Chief Davis, his face a mixture of anger and frustration, turned sharply to Mark. "Officer Tanner," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained fury, "how in the world did this happen? What were you thinking?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He stood there, feeling profoundly exposed, diminished to a fraction of his former self. His usual confidence and commanding presence had evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind a fragile shell of a man who was only now beginning to grasp the sheer scale of his blunder. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, a heavy burden of realization that made his knees weak and his heart race. At this moment, he was no longer the unflappable officer he once prided himself on being. Instead, he was a figure of vulnerability and self-doubt, stripped bare of his former arrogance and self-assuredness. The shock and disappointment in the eyes of his fellow officers were like daggers, piercing through his facade and laying bare the profound embarrassment and regret he felt inside. I thought," Mark stammered, his voice a mere whisper, barely managing to break through the oppressive silence. He glanced around the room, hoping against hope to find a trace of sympathy or understanding in the faces of his colleagues, but all he encountered was a cold, unyielding sea of disapproval. Each gaze seemed to accuse him of his failure, reinforcing the crushing reality of his misjudgment. Chief Davis's stern, unrelenting stare was a relentless reminder of his error, an embodiment of the disappointment that loomed over him like a dark cloud. The chief's voice cut through the silence, each word sharp and unforgiving, demanding an explanation that Mark struggled to provide. The confidence he had once exuded was now replaced by a crippling sense of inadequacy, as the enormity of his mistake became clear. "You thought what?" Officer Tanner. Chief Davis's voice was a mixture of incredulity and condemnation, echoing off the walls like a judge's gavel. "That you could arrest someone without proper cause, that you could dismiss their side of the story without a second thought." The chief's words seemed to reverberate within Mark's mind, amplifying the realization of his failure. The arrogance that had once defined him was crumbling, and with it, the very foundation of his self-belief seemed to be disintegrating. The certainty he had clung to so fervently earlier that night now seemed like a distant, almost laughable illusion. The walls of his self-assured world were collapsing, and in their place was a burgeoning sense of doubt and introspection, shaking him to his core. "I made a terrible mistake," Mark finally managed to say, his voice cracking under the weight of his own emotions. "I let my assumptions and my biases cloud my judgment. I didn't listen. I didn't give Governor Thompson a chance to explain." The words tumbled out, each one a painful admission of his failures. As they left his lips, Mark felt a profound wave of realization crash over him, leaving him feeling utterly exposed. He had always taken pride in his role as a protector of the community, believing in his righteousness. But now, confronted with the tangible consequences of his actions, he saw the deep flaws in his judgment. His preconceived notions and biases, which he had never questioned before, had led him astray, and the burden of that realization weighed heavily on his shoulders. Joseph, despite the ordeal he had just endured, remained remarkably composed. His calm demeanor seemed to bring a semblance of serenity to the charged atmosphere, as if he were an anchor amidst the storm. His eyes met Chief Davis's with a blend of understanding and resolve, conveying a sense of quiet determination. "Chief," Joseph said, his voice steady and reassuring, "I want you to know that I'm not angry about what's happened here tonight. However, I believe it would be beneficial to have a private conversation with Officer Tanner, if that's all right." His words, though calm, carried an undertone of gravity that commanded respect and attention. Chief Davis looked taken aback, his surprise evident as his eyebrows shot up in astonishment. He glanced nervously between Joseph and Mark, his unease palpable. "Governor, are you sure? After what just happened, I don't think." The chief's hesitation was a stark contrast to Joseph's unwavering composure. Joseph's hand, raised in a gentle gesture, interrupted the chief's protest, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I'm sure, Chief. I believe it's necessary." The chief's reluctant nod was a grudging acceptance of Joseph's request, and he directed them to his office with an air of reluctant acquiescence. As Joseph walked towards the office, Mark's heart pounded furiously, each beat echoing his mounting anxiety. His palms were slick with sweat, and a lump formed in his throat, making it hard to breathe. The short distance to the office felt like an eternity, each step heavier than the last, weighed down by a growing sense of dread. Once inside, the soft click of the door closing behind them seemed to amplify the silence, a stark reminder of the gravity of the moment. Mark stood rigid, his back straight and his eyes fixed on a point just over Joseph's shoulder, unable to meet the governor's gaze. The room felt like a pressure cooker. The tension was palpable and almost suffocating. "Officer Tanner," Joseph began, his voice surprisingly gentle and soft. "Please have a seat." The kindness in his tone was a stark contrast to the harshness Mark had anticipated. Mark hesitated, his fear and uncertainty palpable, before slowly lowering himself into one of the chairs. The fear of what might come next gripped him tightly, whether it was the end of his career, legal repercussions, or something worse. He braced himself for the full force of Joseph's authority, expecting the worst. Joseph took his seat across from Mark, leaning forward slightly, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and compassion. The silence that stretched between them was heavy, almost tangible, and Mark felt as if it might break him. Joseph's gaze, steady and understanding, seemed to offer a glimmer of hope amidst the overwhelming tension. The quiet in the room was a stark contrast to the chaos Mark felt inside, and Joseph's calm demeanor, though soft, was a powerful force, making the weight of the moment feel even more profound. "Officer Tanner," Joseph began, his voice a mix of gentleness and resolve, "I want to talk to you about what happened tonight. I'm not speaking to you as the governor right now. I'm speaking to you as another human being who has experienced something deeply unsettling." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the floor. He was unable to meet Joseph's gaze, overwhelmed by a potent mix of shame and fear that coursed through him. Joseph continued with a calm yet probing tone, "When you saw me tonight, what was your initial reaction? What led you to suspect that something was wrong?" Mark's voice barely registered above a whisper as he replied, "You seemed out of place, sir. I thought you might be up to something suspicious." Joseph nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And why did I seem out of place to you? What was it about me that triggered your suspicion?" Mark fell silent, the weight of his own biases beginning to dawn on him. Joseph's voice softened but carried a weight of empathy. "Officer Tanner, what transpired tonight is a textbook example of racial profiling. This practice is not just a minor oversight, it's a dangerous habit that inflicts real harm on innocent people. I was there to assess the safety of our community and to understand how we might improve it for everyone." Instead, I became a direct victim of the very prejudice that makes so many people in our community feel unsafe. A lump formed in Mark's throat, his pride in being a good cop and protector now overshadowed by the glaring reality of his shortcomings. Joseph leaned in, his eyes earnest as they searched Mark's face. This conversation isn't solely about me, Mark. Consider how many other innocent people might have faced unjust treatment due to hasty judgments based on mere appearances. The damage caused by this kind of bias runs deep within our communities. As Joseph's words settled, Mark was overcome with a wave of emotions: guilt, shame, and a burgeoning understanding of the broader impact of his actions. For the first time since entering the room, he lifted his gaze, meeting Joseph's steady eyes. Joseph leaned closer, his expression filled with compassion and concern. Mark, every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. This isn't just about adhering to protocols, it's about recognizing and honoring the humanity in every individual we encounter. Mark nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as he absorbed the weight of Joseph's words. "Let me share a personal story with you," Joseph continued. "When I was younger, I had a close friend named Michael. He was one of the most kind-hearted people I've ever known. But he faced suspicion simply because of the color of his skin. I recall one day when we were walking home from school and were stopped by a police officer. The officer questioned Michael with unnecessary aggression while barely acknowledging me. I saw the fear and hurt in Michael's eyes, and it left an indelible mark on me." Mark's eyes widened as he absorbed this revelation, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. He had been the officer imposing such treatment far too often, never fully grasping the impact of his actions on those he was supposed to serve and protect. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Joseph continued, his tone both gentle and resolute. "And it's not just about personal experiences. I've heard countless stories from people in our community, stories that reveal a pattern of bias and discrimination. There was a mother who was followed around a store by staff members who suspected her of theft simply because of her appearance. There was a father who was stopped and interrogated by the police solely because he was driving a luxury car. And there was a teenager who was subjected to harassment just for walking home from school. To some, these incidents might seem minor or isolated, but when you look at the bigger picture, they accumulate into a pervasive atmosphere of mistrust and fear. They create an environment where people feel unwelcome, unsafe, and alienated in their neighborhoods." As Joseph spoke, Mark's face grew increasingly downcast. He had always justified his actions as necessary measures to maintain order and safety, but now he was starting to confront the reality of the harm he had caused. He felt a pang of guilt as he listened to the stories, realizing how his actions might have contributed to a larger, more damaging pattern. "Officer Tanner," Joseph said, leaning in closer, "I need you to grasp the severity of these biases, whether they're overt or subtle. Whether we're conscious of them or not. They have far-reaching consequences. They chip away at the trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. They make people feel like they don't belong, and in the most tragic cases, they can even lead to serious, irreversible harm." Mark's eyes began to well up with tears as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. He reflected on the numerous times he had acted out of prejudice, causing harm to individuals without fully realizing the impact of his behavior. Joseph observed Mark's emotional response and softened his approach, his voice taking on a more soothing tone. "But Mark," Joseph said gently, "acknowledging these biases is the crucial first step towards meaningful change. This isn't about assigning blame, it's about embracing growth. Each of us has the potential to learn and improve, to become better versions of ourselves." Joseph took a deep breath, his eyes conveying a blend of determination and compassion. He leaned forward and placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder. "Officer Tanner," he said softly, "I'm not here to punish you or to make you feel worse than you already do. I believe in the power of second chances and the opportunity for personal growth." Mark looked up, his eyes wide with astonishment. He had braced himself for anger or even threats to his job, but the governor's unexpected kindness took him completely by surprise. "I want to offer you a unique opportunity," Joseph continued. "We are launching a new state initiative aimed at enhancing relationships between the police and our communities. The program focuses on fostering empathy and understanding. I believe you would be an excellent candidate for this initiative." Mark's jaw dropped in disbelief. He could hardly process what he was hearing. "But after everything I've done, why would you want me involved?" he asked, his voice trembling. Joseph's smile was warm and genuine. "Because you've experienced firsthand the impact of biases. Your journey tonight could serve as a powerful lesson for others. I believe you have the strength and courage to acknowledge your mistakes and work toward improvement." Tears streamed down Mark's face as he felt an overwhelming sense of forgiveness and grace, something he had never anticipated. It touched a deep, unrecognized part of his heart. "Governor Thompson, I don't know what to say," Mark stammered. "Thank you. I promise I'll do everything I can to make things right." Joseph nodded, his smile growing more expansive. "That's all I ask, Mark. We all have room to grow and learn. This program will provide you with the tools you need to make that growth happen." As Mark listened to the details of the initiative, a flicker of hope ignited within him. For the first time in years, he saw an opportunity to become the officer he had always aspired to be, one who genuinely served and protected every member of his community. Just then, the police chief entered the room, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Joseph quickly updated him on the proposal he had extended to Mark. The chief listened intently, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the details of the plan. "Governor," the chief said, his voice measured with a hint of skepticism, "I appreciate your effort to transform this unfortunate situation into a learning opportunity, but are you certain about this decision?" Joseph nodded with unwavering confidence. "I am, Chief. I firmly believe that Officer Tanner has the potential to make a significant contribution to this initiative. His experiences tonight could provide invaluable insights to help other officers recognize and address their own biases." The chief considered Joseph's words thoughtfully, his gaze shifting to Mark, who was seated silently with his eyes cast downward. After a moment of contemplation, the chief spoke again, his tone softened but resolute. "Very well, Governor. If you are confident that this is the right course of action, I will support it. Officer Tanner, are you willing to participate in this program?" Mark lifted his head, his face a mixture of hope, uncertainty, and apprehension. He looked from the chief to Joseph and back again. I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," he admitted hesitantly. "What if I can't change?" Joseph leaned forward, his expression full of empathy and encouragement. "Mark, the fact that you're concerned about your ability to change shows that you're already on the path to transformation. It's natural to have doubts, but don't let them deter you from giving it a chance." Mark took a deep breath, his shoulders slightly slumped as he grappled with the weight of the decision before him. He recognized this as a crucial moment to make amends, to become a better officer, and to address his past mistakes. Yet the road ahead seemed daunting. "Okay," he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. "I'll do it. I owe it to you, Governor, and to everyone I've wronged because of my biases. I just hope I can meet your expectations." Joseph's smile was warm and reassuring. "It's not about meeting my expectations, Mark. It's about striving to become the best version of yourself. I believe you can do that." As the details of the program were outlined, Mark listened intently. Though his mind was clouded with doubts and fears, he began to entertain the possibility that this could be his chance for redemption. Perhaps, Just maybe, this initiative could be his path to becoming a better person and officer. The following week, Mark found himself in a brightly lit conference room, surrounded by a diverse group of officers from various precincts. The atmosphere was thick with tension and apprehension. At the front of the room stood Dr. Angela Chen, a distinguished psychologist and expert in unconscious bias. "Welcome everyone," Dr. Chen began, her tone both warm and authoritative. "Today we're here to address an issue that affects us all: unconscious bias." Mark shifted uneasily in his seat, feeling his defenses rise despite his resolve to remain open-minded. He had made a commitment, after all. As Dr. Chen began to explain the science behind unconscious bias, Mark struggled to grasp some of the concepts. She described how our brains quickly form judgments based on past experiences and societal influences, often without our conscious awareness. These biases can influence our actions, even when we believe we are acting fairly. Dr. Chen explained, her eyes scanning the room. Her gaze briefly met Mark's, and he felt a sharp pang of guilt. Dr. Chen's words resonated with Mark as she detailed how unconscious biases can impact behavior and decision-making. Despite his initial discomfort, Mark recognized that this was a critical opportunity for growth. The path to redemption was beginning, and he had to confront the uncomfortable truths about himself if he wanted to truly change. The workshop progressed to interactive exercises designed to deepen the participants' understanding of unconscious bias. In one activity, officers were shown photographs of various individuals and asked to write down their initial impressions. Mark was taken aback by how swiftly he made assumptions based solely on appearance. He was stunned to see how quickly he categorized people, realizing the prejudices that had shaped his perceptions. As the day went on, Mark's engagement increased. He listened with rapt attention as community leaders shared their personal experiences of being unfairly targeted due to bias. Their stories resonated deeply with him, echoing his recent encounter with Governor Joseph and the gravity of the situation. During a group discussion, Mark raised his hand tentatively. His voice was tinged with uncertainty as he spoke. I never fully grasped how these biases were influencing my work. How do we begin to address something that feels so ingrained?" Dr. Chen offered an encouraging smile. "Recognizing the problem is a crucial first step, Officer Tanner. Change requires time and deliberate effort, but it is indeed possible." As the workshop drew to a close, Mark felt a tumult of emotions. He was overwhelmed by the realization of how deeply entrenched his biases were, yet a small glimmer of hope flickered within him. For the first time, he genuinely grasped the significance of this training and its potential to foster real change. The following sessions thrust Mark into increasingly complex role-playing scenarios. Each scenario was designed to place him in the position of those he had previously judged unfairly. Initially, he felt awkward and resistant, but as he immersed himself in the exercises, a profound shift began to take place within him. In one particularly challenging scenario, Mark played the role of a young black man being stopped by the police for no discernible reason. As he acted out the scene, he felt a tight knot form in his stomach. The fear and frustration he was supposed to portray suddenly felt alarmingly real. "How can I assist you?" Officer Mark asked, his voice quivering slightly as he tried to channel the character's anxiety. The officer playing his counterpart adopted the same authoritative stance Mark had used countless times before. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for. I need to see some ID." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the scene unfolded, Mark was inundated with a torrent of emotions he had never experienced before: helplessness, anger, and humiliation. It was as if a tidal wave had crashed over him, revealing the profound impact of his previous actions on those he had stopped and questioned. For the first time, he understood the emotional and psychological toll of his behavior. After the exercise, the group gathered to share their reflections. Mark's voice was choked with emotion as he spoke. I never truly understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end," he confessed. "The fear, the powerlessness, it's overwhelming," Dr. Chen nodded, her expression supportive. "That's precisely the objective of these exercises, Officer Tanner. They are designed to foster empathy and understanding." In the days that followed, Mark participated in a variety of scenarios. He portrayed a Hispanic teenager being followed around a store, an elderly Asian woman being disregarded while reporting a crime, and a Middle Eastern man facing harassment at an airport. Each role-playing exercise chipped away at the walls of prejudice he had built over the years, contributing to a gradual but profound transformation in his outlook. One evening, as Mark drove home from the training, he found himself immersed in deep contemplation about his career and its repercussions. The road seemed endless as his thoughts wandered through the countless moments when he had acted on his biases, the numerous people he might have unknowingly hurt. The weight of these realizations was heavy, almost unbearable. It was as though the miles he drove were stretching out in front of him, each one laden with the burden of his past actions. For the first time, Mark felt an overwhelming, sincere desire to change. The comfortable certainties of his previous mindset had been shattered, replaced by a profound sense of responsibility and the urgent need to reevaluate his approach to policing. The following day, the training session was a turning point. Mark found himself in a room filled with community leaders from diverse backgrounds, each prepared to share their personal stories. The atmosphere was charged with a complex mix of tension, hope, and raw emotion. As Maria, a middle-aged Latina woman, began to speak, her voice wavered, and her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. She described a harrowing encounter with law enforcement, one that had left her feeling dehumanized and marginalized. "I was just walking home from work," she recounted, her voice cracking under the weight of her memories. "But the officer who stopped me treated me as though I were a criminal, as though I didn't belong in my neighborhood." Mark felt a deep pang in his chest, a visceral reaction that made him confront the many times he had conducted similar stops, often with a similar mindset. Maria's story unfolded with a haunting clarity, and as Mark listened, he began to see the events from her perspective, feeling the sting of her pain as if it were his own. The next speaker, James, a young black man barely out of his teens, brought Mark face to face with a fear that was all too real. James's voice trembled with emotion as he recounted a routine traffic stop that escalated into a terrifying ordeal. "I was so scared," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I followed every command, but the officer's anger seemed to grow. I honestly thought I might not make it home that night." Mark's stomach churned violently as he recognized the aggressive tactics James described, tactics he had once used, convinced they were justified. The realization that his actions had contributed to someone's profound fear and sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. As James spoke, Mark felt a deep, visceral shame, as if the weight of his past decisions was pressing down on him, revealing the harsh reality of his previous behavior. As more stories emerged, each one more heartbreaking than the last, Mark was inundated with a wave of emotions. He heard about missed job opportunities due to racial profiling, children terrified to play outside because of the looming presence of police, and families torn apart by biased arrests. Each narrative was a piercing reminder of the damage his actions had inflicted and the depth of the harm caused by his prejudices. During a brief break, Mark stepped outside, his mind reeling from the emotional toll. He looked up at the sky, struggling to blink back the tears that threatened to fall. The weight of his badge and the responsibility it carried had never felt so profound. For the first time in his career, he truly grasped the gravity of his role and the impact of his actions on the lives of those he was sworn to protect. When the session resumed, Mark listened with a new depth of empathy. He no longer saw the speakers through the lens of his previous biases, but as individuals with their own stories, hopes, and dreams. The world he had once understood so clearly was shifting beneath him, and though the discomfort was intense, he recognized it as a necessary and transformative process. As the day drew to a close, Mark approached Maria with a heart full of contrition and a newfound resolve. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "I want to thank you for sharing your story," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I understand now that it must have been incredibly difficult. I am profoundly sorry for what you went through, and I promise to do better." Maria's eyes widened in surprise before softening with understanding. She reached out and gently squeezed Mark's hand, her gesture a small beacon of hope. "That's all we can ask for," she said, her voice steady but kind. "That you listen, understand, and strive to change." Her words, filled with compassion, offered a glimpse of the possibility of redemption and a future where empathy could lead to meaningful change. As the final day of training drew to a close, Mark found himself sitting quietly in his chair, deep in thought. The events of the past few days had left him emotionally drained, but also filled with a sense of awakening. His mind raced with all that he had learned, lessons that challenged his beliefs, exposed his biases, and forced him to confront the man he had become. The weight of his past actions bore down on him, a constant reminder of the mistakes he had made. Yet, amidst the guilt and regret, there was something new, something unfamiliar: hope. For the first time in years, Mark felt a genuine commitment to change, a determination to make amends for the wrongs he had done. Taking a deep breath, Mark rose from his seat and made his way across the room to where Joseph was engaged in conversation with several community leaders. As he approached, Joseph noticed him and turned with a warm, welcoming smile. Officer Tanner, Joseph greeted him, extending his hand. "How are you feeling?" Mark grasped Joseph's hand firmly, his emotions evident in the tightness of his grip and the intensity in his eyes. "Governor, I don't even know where to begin," Mark started, his voice thick with emotion. "These past few days have opened my eyes in ways I never imagined possible. I've been forced to confront some hard truths about myself." Joseph listened intently, his expression encouraging as he gave Mark the space to speak his mind. "I want to thank you," Mark continued, his words coming out in a rush now, as if he feared losing the moment. "Not just for this opportunity, but for your forgiveness. That night I was so wrong, and yet you showed me a kindness that I didn't deserve." Joseph's eyes softened with understanding. "We all make mistakes, Mark," he said gently. "What's important is that we learn from them and grow. Every one of us deserves the chance to change." Mark nodded, struggling to hold back tears. "I feel like I'm seeing the world clearly for the first time," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I've got a long road ahead, and I have a lot of work to do to make things right, but I'm committed. I'm ready to do whatever it takes, no matter how difficult it might be." Joseph placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, his touch filled with compassion. "That's all anyone can ask for, Mark. The path to redemption isn't easy, but you won't be walking it alone." Mark looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You mean?" Joseph's smile broadened, his eyes filled with warmth. "I'll be here to support you, Mark. We're in this together, working towards a better, more just community. You're not alone in this journey." Mark's transformation had ignited a new sense of purpose within him. As he prepared to step into his new role as a leader in the state initiative, he felt a determination he had never known before. The burden of his past mistakes still weighed heavily on his conscience, but instead of crippling him, it now served as a powerful motivator, fueling his resolve to make a positive difference. On a bright Monday morning, Mark found himself standing before a group of fellow officers in the precinct's conference room. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform, but his voice remained steady and resolute as he began to speak. "I have been where many of you are now," he started, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each of his colleagues. "I thought I was doing my job, protecting our community, but I was wrong. My biases, my ignorance they were hurting the very people we swore to serve. The room grew quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Mark paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. I'm here to tell you that change is possible. It's not easy, and it requires us to look hard at ourselves and our actions, but it's necessary. I'm asking each of you to join me on this journey of transformation. As Mark shared his experiences from the training, he could sense the impact his words were having on the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wrestling with their thoughts, while others nodded in understanding, their expressions reflecting a willingness to listen and learn. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. He spoke passionately about the role-playing exercises that had forced him to see things from the perspective of those he had once judged. He described the eye-opening discussions with community leaders, the candid conversations that had shattered his preconceived notions, and the profound realizations he had made about himself and his role as an officer. This isn't just about following new rules, Mark emphasized, his voice rising with conviction. It's about truly seeing the people we serve, understanding their experiences, and building trust within our community. In the weeks that followed, Mark threw himself into his new role with a vigor and enthusiasm that surprised even himself. He worked tirelessly, organizing workshops, facilitating discussions between officers and community members, and leading by example. His passion was infectious, and slowly but surely more officers began to sign up for the training program. Mark's journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path, a path that led not only to his redemption but also to the healing and betterment of the community he had once failed. One sunny afternoon, as Mark meticulously prepared materials for an upcoming session, he noticed Officer Sarah Santos approaching him. Her stride was purposeful, and her expression was a blend of curiosity and contemplation. "I've been watching you, Tanner," she began, her tone measured yet sincere. "At first I wasn't sure about this whole initiative. I had my doubts. But seeing how much you've changed, how it's impacted you, well, I think I'm ready to give it a try." Mark felt a rush of optimism, a glimmer of hope that perhaps the change he so desperately sought was finally beginning to take root. "That's fantastic, Sarah," he replied warmly, his voice laced with encouragement. "I promise you, it won't be easy. It's going to challenge you in ways you might not expect, but it's worth it. Together we can make a real difference, not just in this department, but in the community we serve." As the weeks passed, more officers began to join the initiative. Mark could feel a palpable shift within the department, a subtle but significant transformation. Conversations among the officers were changing, the old, hardened attitudes were giving way to new perspectives and a growing sense of empathy. The department, once divided by skepticism and resistance, was beginning to unite under a common goal. The culmination of these efforts was a series of community meetings designed to foster open dialogue between the police and the residents they served. Mark and Joseph, standing side by side at the front of a bustling community center, felt the weight of the moment. The room buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease as police officers and residents filled the seats, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions from hope to apprehension. This was the first of many such meetings they had planned across the state, and both men understood its critical importance. Joseph, with his calm and steady demeanor, stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice, warm and inviting, immediately commanded attention. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We're here to start a conversation, to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, and to create a safer, more understanding environment for all of us." Mark, standing beside him, nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the crowd. He could see the wariness on some faces, the hope on others, and the deep-seated distrust that many still held. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the crowd with a mixture of humility and resolve. "I know there's been a lot of distrust between law enforcement and the community," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "I've been part of that problem, and I own that. But today, we're here to take a step towards being part of the solution." As the meeting progressed, Joseph and Mark facilitated discussions between officers and residents, breaking the large group into smaller circles to encourage open and honest dialogue. Initially, the conversations were tentative, with both sides hesitant to speak freely. But as time passed, barriers began to fall, and stories began to flow, stories of fear, frustration, pain, and ultimately a shared desire for change. In one corner, an elderly woman spoke softly about her fear of calling the police, even when she desperately needed help. A young officer listened intently, his expression shifting from surprise to genuine concern as he absorbed her words. In another group, a teenager, his voice tinged with both anger and sadness, spoke about feeling targeted because of his race. A veteran officer, his face lined with the experiences of many years on the job, responded by sharing the pressures and fears that come with wearing the badge, fostering a moment of mutual understanding. Joseph moved from group to group, offering words of encouragement and guidance, his presence a calming influence on the proceedings. He could see the seeds of change being planted, and it filled him with a deep sense of hope for the future. Mark, too, was deeply moved by what he witnessed: the tentative steps toward understanding, the willingness of his fellow officers to listen and learn, and the slow but steady erosion of the walls that had long divided the community and the police. As the weeks turned into months, Joseph and Mark took their initiative on the road, visiting police departments in communities across the state. Their partnership deepened, and their efforts began to bear significant fruit. Police departments started embracing the new training protocols with a renewed sense of purpose, and community members reported feeling more comfortable and trusting when interacting with officers. Mark's ongoing outreach to those he had wronged became a cornerstone of his personal and professional redemption, though the path was still fraught with challenges. One day, Mark arranged to meet with Tyrell at a local coffee shop. 2 years earlier, Mark had wrongfully arrested Tyrell, a mistake that had left deep scars on both men. As they sat across from each other, the air was thick with tension. Tyrell's eyes were guarded, reflecting both hurt and a flicker of hope. Mark knew that this conversation was a critical step in his journey toward redemption. Taking a deep breath, Mark began, "Tyrell, I wanted to apologize for what happened to you. I know that words alone can't undo the harm I caused, but I hope that through my actions moving forward, I can start to make things right." Tyrell's expression softened slightly, though he remained cautious. "I appreciate the apology, Mark. It means a lot that you're trying to make amends, but it's going to take time to rebuild trust." Mark nodded earnestly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I understand, Tyrell. I'm here to listen and to do whatever I can to support you." Their conversation, though difficult, marked a significant step forward in Mark's ongoing journey of redemption. He continued to reach out to others he had wronged, facing a range of reactions but maintaining an unwavering commitment to making amends. As the initiative gained momentum, it caught the attention of local media. The story of transformation, of hope and reconciliation began to spread, capturing the imagination of many who heard it. One bright morning, Mark found himself in a brightly lit television studio, sitting across from a friendly news anchor. The red light of the camera blinked on, and Mark took a deep breath, ready to share the story of the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment, a journey of mistakes, redemption, and the power of change. The anchor began with a warm smile. "Officer Mark Tanner, thank you for being here today. Your journey has captured the hearts and minds of many. Can you share with us what this experience has been like for you?" Mark nodded, his expression a blend of humility and resolve. "It's been a challenging path, but also incredibly rewarding," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I've had to face some hard truths about my own biases and the damage they caused. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." As he spoke, his words carried the weight of his experiences, emphasizing the importance of empathy, understanding, and the deep need for personal growth in law enforcement. His sincerity was palpable, leaving a lasting impression on those listening. In a separate interview, Governor Joseph Thompson sat across from another reporter, his calm demeanor exuding a quiet strength and deep compassion. "Governor Thompson, what motivated you to offer Officer Tanner this chance for redemption?" the reporter asked, leaning in with genuine curiosity. Joseph leaned forward slightly, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of his years. "I have always believed in the power of second chances," he replied, his voice measured and thoughtful. Mark's willingness to change and grow is a testament to the resilience and transformative power of the human spirit. It's a powerful reminder that forgiveness isn't just about letting go of the past, it's about creating a better future. As these interviews aired, viewers across the state found themselves deeply moved by this story of redemption and hope. Conversations began to spring up in living rooms, coffee shops, and community centers, as people from all walks of life discussed the profound themes of bias, forgiveness, and the capacity for change. The story resonated on a personal level, prompting many to reflect on their own biases and the potential for growth within themselves and their communities. One evening, a local community group in a small town gathered to watch a special report on the police reform initiative. As Mark's face appeared on the screen, recounting his journey of self-discovery and change, the room fell silent. "I never thought I'd see the day," an elderly woman whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "Maybe there's hope for all of us." The impact of Mark's story reached far beyond the borders of his community. It inspired individuals across the state to look within themselves, to question their assumptions and prejudices, and to take meaningful action in their neighborhoods. Weeks later, as Mark patrolled the same upscale neighborhood where he had first encountered Joseph, he noticed a figure walking slowly along the sidewalk, pausing frequently to study the houses with a notebook in hand. A familiar twinge of suspicion flickered in his mind, but Mark remembered his training and the lessons he had learned. Instead of reacting with immediate concern, he took a deep breath, adjusted his approach, and walked over to the individual calmly. "Good evening," Mark called out with a friendly tone. "I'm Officer Tanner. I noticed you're taking a lot of interest in these houses. Would you mind sharing what you're working on?" The person turned to reveal a young woman, her expression startled. She clutched her notebook tightly, her eyes darting nervously. I'm sorry," she stammered, clearly taken aback. "I'm an architecture student. I'm studying the designs of these homes for a school project." Mark's face softened with genuine interest. "That sounds fascinating. Would you mind telling me more about your project? I'd love to hear what you've learned so far." The woman's tension eased, and she began to explain her assignment in detail. Mark listened attentively, nodding thoughtfully, as she described the architectural features she found intriguing and the historical significance of the neighborhood. "That's impressive," Mark said sincerely when she finished. "I never realized how much thought and detail went into designing these homes. Thank you for sharing your insights with me." The woman smiled, and her initial nervousness completely dissipated. "Thank you for listening, Officer Tanner. To be honest, I was a little worried you might think I was doing something suspicious." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm glad we had the chance to talk. My job is to keep the neighborhood safe, but it's also important to understand what's going on. Would you like me to walk with you for a bit? I could point out some other interesting houses in the area." The woman's face lit up with enthusiasm, and they began to stroll down the sidewalk together, engaging in a lively conversation. As they walked, Mark felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. He handled the situation with empathy and understanding, leading to a positive interaction that left both of them feeling respected and valued. As the weeks turned into months, the partnership between Joseph and Mark grew even stronger. Their collaborative efforts to improve community-police relations began to yield tangible results, fostering a newfound sense of trust and cooperation within the community. They met regularly to discuss the progress of their police reform initiative, brainstorming new ideas and refining their strategies to ensure lasting change. One sunny afternoon, Joseph invited Mark to visit his office in the state capitol for a more in-depth discussion. As Mark entered the grand building, he couldn't help but feel a surge of awe and reflection on how far he had come since that pivotal night. "Mark, I'm glad you could make it," Joseph greeted him warmly, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I've been thinking about our next steps and how we can continue to build on the momentum we've created." Mark nodded eagerly, his mind racing with ideas. "I'm all ears, Governor. Let's keep this going." Their conversation flowed easily, filled with mutual respect and a shared commitment to making a difference. Together, they envisioned a future where stories like Mark's would become the norm, rather than the exception, a future where forgiveness, understanding, and the willingness to change could truly transform lives and communities for the better. Governor Joseph leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with determination as he spoke. "It's time we initiate some crucial policy changes within our police department. Mandatory bias training for all officers should be our top priority. We cannot afford to delay this any longer." Mark, sitting across from him, felt a deep resonance with Joseph's words. "I couldn't agree more," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "The bias training I underwent completely changed my perspective, both as an officer and as a person. Every officer deserves that same opportunity for growth." With a shared sense of urgency, they immersed themselves in the task ahead. Hours turned into days as they pored over documents, analyzed statistics, and consulted with experts. Together, they meticulously crafted a comprehensive proposal that would mandate bias training for every police officer in the state. Their commitment to the cause was unwavering, and they knew that the road ahead would be challenging. The proposal was just the beginning. They reached out to community leaders, police chiefs, and lawmakers, tirelessly advocating for their initiative. Joseph and Mark attended countless meetings where they passionately explained the necessity of bias training, emphasizing how it would lead to a more just and effective police force. They encountered both support and skepticism, but their dedication never wavered. As word of their efforts spread, momentum began to build. People from all walks of life started to rally behind their cause, recognizing the need for reform. Joseph and Mark found themselves invited to speak at community events, police summits, and even national conferences. They shared their personal stories, highlighting the transformative power of bias training and the positive impact it could have on police-community relations. Despite the growing support, they faced resistance from those who were fearful of change or who questioned the need for such reforms. Some critics accused them of undermining the police force, but Joseph and Mark remained resolute. They leaned on each other during these difficult times, their shared vision and commitment serving as a source of strength. After months of tireless effort, their hard work finally paid off. The state legislature passed a landmark bill mandating bias training for all police officers. It was a significant victory, marking a pivotal moment in their fight for justice and equality. At the press conference announcing the new law, Joseph placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We've come a long way, my friend," he said softly, his eyes reflecting the weight of the journey they had undertaken together. Mark nodded, his eyes misting with emotion. "And we still have a long way to go," he replied, his voice steady with resolve. "But together I believe we can make a real difference." As the new policies took effect, Mark found himself in a unique position within the police department. His transformation from a once biased officer to a champion of change had not gone unnoticed by his colleagues. Initially, some officers were skeptical of his new approach, unsure if his commitment to reform was genuine. But as they observed the positive impact of his changed behavior, both within the department and in the community, their attitudes began to shift. One day, during a routine shift briefing, a young officer named Maria approached Mark. Her voice was hesitant, but there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "Officer Tanner," she began, "I've been watching how you interact with the community. It's different in a good way. Could you maybe show me how you do it?" Mark's heart swelled with pride, and he smiled warmly at Maria. "Of course, Maria, I'd be happy to," he replied, seeing in her the same desire for change that had ignited his journey. From that moment on, Mark took on the role of a mentor. He guided Maria and other younger officers who were eager to learn, taking them on ride-along, where he demonstrated how to approach every situation with empathy and respect. He shared his own experiences, including the mistakes he had made in the past, hoping to impart the importance of treating every person with dignity and understanding. Remember, Mark would often say during their discussions, "Every person we encounter has a story. Our job is to listen and understand before we act." Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, the department began to see a noticeable shift. Officers who had once been quick to judge were now taking the time to listen. Community complaints decreased, and positive interactions increased. The atmosphere within the department started to change, as empathy and inclusivity became guiding principles rather than afterthoughts. During a community outreach event, Mark happened to overhear two veteran officers discussing the changes. One of them, who had been a vocal skeptic of the reforms, spoke with a newfound sense of understanding. "You know, I was skeptical at first," he admitted. "But I've got to admit, Tanner's approach is making a difference. I feel like I'm helping people now, not just enforcing laws." The other officer nodded in agreement, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, it's like we're part of the community now, not just policing it." Mark couldn't help but smile to himself as he listened to their conversation. The journey had been long and challenging, but at that moment, he knew that they were on the right path. The changes were slow, but they were real. The department was becoming what it was meant to be: a force for good, a protector of all people, and a true part of the community it served. Mark felt a deep surge of pride as he heard those words. The progress within the department was undeniable. What had once been a place driven by rigid protocols and sometimes harsh judgments was slowly transforming into an institution where compassion and respect were valued as much as bravery and dedication. This evolution wasn't just a policy change, it was a cultural shift that permeated the very core of their mission. As news of the initiative's success spread, it began to attract attention far beyond their state. Other states took notice, curious about the program that had blossomed from a chance encounter between Joseph and Mark. Soon, police departments across the country were reaching out, eager to learn how they could implement similar changes within their communities. The demand for Mark and Joseph skyrocketed. Invitations to speak at national law enforcement conferences poured in, and their schedules became packed with engagements. Each speaking opportunity was a chance to share their journey and the hard-earned lessons they had gathered along the way. At one such conference in Chicago, Mark found himself standing before a packed auditorium of police officers and administrators from across the country. "A few years ago, I was part of the problem," Mark began, his voice steady and sincere as he looked out at the sea of faces. "My bias led me to make a terrible mistake. But thanks to Governor Tanner Thompson's forgiveness and guidance, I was given a chance to change." The room was silent as the weight of his words hung in the air. Joseph joined Mark on stage, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder before addressing the audience. "What Officer Tanner and I have learned," Joseph said, his voice resonating with conviction, "is that true change comes from within. It requires honesty, humility, and a willingness to confront our prejudices." As they spoke, the audience listened intently. Many nodded in recognition, some with the solemnity of shared experience, while others furiously scribbled notes, eager to bring these insights back to their departments. The impact of their words was palpable, a ripple of realization spreading through the room. After the conference, several police chiefs approached Mark and Joseph, eager to discuss how they could bring similar programs to their departments. One chief from Texas, his voice tinged with urgency, said, "What you've done in your state is incredible. We need this kind of change everywhere." In the months that followed, Mark and Joseph found themselves crisscrossing the country, conducting workshops and helping other states set up their initiatives. They worked tirelessly, sharing their experiences and providing guidance on how to implement effective bias training and community outreach programs. The message of unity and understanding, which had begun as a small effort in their home state, was now spreading far and wide, influencing law enforcement practices nationwide. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. One evening, after another successful workshop, Mark sat alone in his hotel room, lost in thought. The past few years had been a whirlwind of change, and he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this point. He remembered the night he had arrested Joseph, how anger and suspicion had clouded his judgment, leading to one of the biggest mistakes of his career. The shame of that moment still lingered, a sharp reminder of how far he had come. But now, instead of paralyzing him, it fueled his determination to keep pushing forward, to ensure that others didn't make the same mistakes. Mark picked up a framed photo from his nightstand, a picture of him and Joseph at the launch of their first statewide training program. The smiles on their faces spoke volumes about the hope and determination they shared, a silent testament to the power of second chances and the strength of their partnership. "I've come so far," Mark whispered to himself, the words carrying a mixture of pride and humility. "But there's still so much work to do." He knew his transformation was an ongoing process. Every day brought new challenges and new opportunities to grow and learn. Just last week, he had caught himself making a snap judgment about a young man in a hoodie, a reflex born of years of ingrained bias. But this time, he had recognized the bias as it surfaced and consciously chose to approach the situation with an open mind. The interaction ended with a meaningful conversation rather than an escalation, a small victory in his journey toward being a better officer and a better human being. Mark felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he thought about the officers he had trained. Many had shared stories of how the program had changed their approach to policing and how they now approached their work with a greater sense of empathy and understanding. Some had even become trainers themselves, spreading the message to their departments, creating ripples of change that extended beyond what Mark had ever imagined. As he prepared for bed, Mark reflected on the words of a young officer he had spoken to earlier that day. "You've shown us that it's okay to admit we're not perfect," the officer had said, his voice filled with earnestness, "and that we can always strive to be better." Those words resonated deeply with Mark. He knew his journey was far from over, but he was committed to continuing his growth and helping others do the same. With a sense of purpose and determination, Mark closed his eyes, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The next day dawned bright and clear, with the sun shining warmly on the community park, where people from all walks of life had gathered for a special celebration. Colorful banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, announcing the success of the police community initiative. Laughter and cheerful chatter filled the air as children played on the grass and adults mingled, sharing stories and smiles. Mark stood at the edge of the park, taking it all in. The scene before him was a vivid reminder of how far they had come, not just as a department, but as a community. The initiative had started as a simple idea, a hopeful vision of what could be. Now it was a reality, a living, breathing testament to the power of change and the resilience of the human spirit. As he watched a group of officers interact with the community, playing games with the children and chatting with the adults, Mark felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what policing should be: an integral part of the community, built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. It was a long road to get here, and the journey was far from over, but at that moment Mark knew they were on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly hopeful for the future. Mark stood beside Joseph at the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning the vibrant scene unfolding before them. His heart swelled with emotion as he observed the officers in uniform, no longer symbols of fear but members of the community, engaging in friendly conversation with the people they served. The air was filled with laughter, the sound of children playing, and the hum of casual conversations, an atmosphere so different from the tense, distrustful one that had once plagued the relationship between law enforcement and the public. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Joseph asked, his voice tinged with awe and wonder. Mark shook his head slowly, still trying to grasp the enormity of the transformation. "It's incredible," he replied softly, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and pride. "I never thought I'd see anything like this." As they watched, a young girl, no more than 6 or 7, cautiously approached a police officer. Her small hand clutched a single flower, a token of innocence and trust. The officer, noticing her approach, knelt to her level, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile as he accepted the gift. The girl's mother stood nearby, her eyes shining with unshed tears, overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. There was a time, not too long ago, when such a scene would have been unthinkable, a distant dream amid division and distrust. Yet now it was becoming the new normal, a sign of the healing that was taking place. Joseph placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You should be proud, Mark. You've played a big part in making this happen," he said, his voice filled with sincere admiration. Mark nodded, struggling to find the words to express the depth of his feelings. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'm just grateful for the chance to make things right, to be a part of something so much bigger than myself," he said, his eyes reflecting the weight of his journey and the hope for the future. As they made their way through the crowd, people stopped them to share words of thanks and encouragement. Each handshake, each smile was a testament to the trust that had been rebuilt, the fear and suspicion that had been replaced with genuine warmth and understanding. Mark was struck by the transformation not just in the community, but within himself. He had come so far from that fateful night when his prejudices had nearly destroyed everything. Now, he was standing at the heart of something extraordinary, part of a movement that was creating a world where understanding and compassion could prevail over ignorance and fear. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Mark felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over him. This was what he had fought for, what he had worked tirelessly to achieve. The road had been long and often difficult, but standing there, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, Mark knew that every step had been worth it. He looked over at Joseph, who was smiling as he spoke with a group of community members. They had done this together, driven by a shared vision and an unwavering belief in the possibility of change. And as Mark turned back to the scene before him, he allowed himself to feel the pride and gratitude that had been building within him for so long. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning that held the promise of a brighter, more just future for everyone. Thank you for watching. We've explored a powerful and eye-opening story today about a misunderstanding that escalated due to prejudice and bias. It's a reminder of how important it is to approach every situation with an open mind and empathy. What have you learned from today's video? Share one thing you've gained from this story and how you plan to bring it into your own life in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, please leave a comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more engaging content. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful stories and discussions.